All set? Great. All right, let's get started. The clock is running. My name is Jim Vogt. I'm the President and CEO of Zetaset. We're going to be talking about Hadoop in the business unit, specifically the enterprise. Is everybody having a pretty good show so far? This is the end of it, right? I'm glad you're spread out so we can take full value from the room here. I think there's only about 40, 50 people here. What I'm going to be talking about, the whole show has been about developing within this new ecosystem, Hadoop, and making good progress there. The hard reality is that in many enterprises today, people are still evaluating versus deploying. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think there's a lot of good work going on, but essentially there are people that are focused in on the open source itself, and there are other companies like Zetaset that are focused on putting things around the open source that will create a solution for the enterprise that they'll have confidence in and be able to deploy in an active production environment. As such, these are more around not technical issues per se, but business issues. So compliance that drives security, application integrity and availability, data integrity, repeatability, scalability. Those are the types of things we're going to be talking about today, and I'm not going to be the only one talking. In my slides, you'll see a lot of sightings from analysts, and more importantly, one of the key rules I learned as a product manager way back was listen to the customer. And you can see some of the requirements that we're hearing out in the marketplace in terms of real customer requirements. So let's start it off with a nifty cartoon. I'll give you a few seconds to read this. There's a ton of hype around this market. It's been that way for the last 3 to 5 years. So this kind of tells the story. People get very excited about it. But the reality is two things. There's two takeaways from the slide. One is that the real thing pulling the market is the analytics. And so we have to make the infrastructure secure, deployable, and highly available for those analytics. Secondly, it's a framework. It's a very useful framework. But if we don't start to put some of the other pieces around it, it's going to remain a framework versus a solution. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Nobody laughed at this, so I hope it was a little funny. So Hadoop is literally in its infancy. And if you read the press, it's not in its infancy, but if you go talk to customers, the issue is that there are a lot of things still developing in the marketplace, which are very good and very exciting, and I think we're making very good progress. What first drew people to the technology was the cost effectiveness of it, and being able to have a very low, a commodity-driven store that's scalable, that they could handle these multiple data sources. But it's more than that, and I think that the goal shouldn't be to have this thing as an adjunct store. The goal should be to make it a main store that actually underpins all of the business operations. And I think that's where we're headed, but we just have a little more work to do. And in doing that work, if you want it to be a main store, it means security, high availability, repeatability, deployment, automation. All of those elements have to permeate each piece of the stack here. And so at each point of access, at each point of application, it's consistent, and there's no holes in it. And essentially, it's a real, true end-to-end functioning system. And so that's what we're trying to put together here for the enterprise customer. So Merv actually presented at the conference here. We talk with Merv regularly. Essentially, security is the key issue. I'm going to show you some other customer testimonials further on in the presentation. But essentially, this is the story. Security is first and foremost. It's being driven by compliance. We're going to talk a lot about that today. But secondly, there's still a lot of manual pieces of the puzzle. There's still a little bit of a clunkiness to it. And we're going to talk about the mix of ProServe versus software, for example, which is indicative of where we are in the market right now today. So there are a lot of things that we have to do to essentially make that goal the main store. This is a great survey, and let me just lay it out for you. The light blue bar, it's a little bit of an eye chart, so I'll walk you through it, but the light blue bar was an IDG survey done a year ago, and then there was another one done this year. And so you can see a little bit of the trending of the responses. Security continues to be one of the key concerns in terms of deploying in active data centers within operational environments. That's still a key issue. Good news is it looks like they might have found a little more budget, so that's less of a concern. There's still concern about the labor-intensive piece of this. Essentially, am I going to be able to take on this infrastructure without having to hire a ton of people? So that's a concern still. And I think also the development times come down a little bit, so we are making progress in terms of making it easier to use. That's good. But the key one here that I want to draw attention to as well is integrating within legacy environments. So as an old salty enterprise guy, there's a saying that we have, there is no such thing as greenfield. There is no such thing as greenfield. So no matter where you go, you're going to have to integrate your new technology with something. So being able to integrate your security solution isn't just showing up with a new security solution within Hadoop. It's a security solution that has to take advantage of the infrastructure. They have hardware security modules that house keys. They're KMIP compliant. They want to tie that into the Hadoop infrastructure and the key management scheme that we've come up with, right? So there's a lot of attention to, let's not recreate within the ecosystem. Let's augment and complement what's already existing in the infrastructure. That will increase the adoption rate of this technology considerably. And if you look at security itself, the big issue with security, there's a couple points I want to make with this slide. The big issue is it's expensive. When you have a breach, it's expensive, and there's all kinds of different expenses. You look at the recent breaches. So Michael's is a more recent one. Target and eBay are recent ones as well. There was actually a news report that came out from CBS News just yesterday afternoon. There was a poll taken. A quarter of those interviewed said they're no longer buying anything on the internet since the eBay and Target breaches. That's pretty significant. 56% said, I'm starting to pare down the sites I'm going to in general. Now, the hard reality is if they go brick and mortar, meaning they go physically to the store, it's only about a 10% reduction in risk. So that's not the answer. You still have tie into the networks and the internet, and essentially you still have exposure there. But beside the CEO losing his job, beside all the card replacement and the cost of that, essentially $71 billion was materialized in revenue in Q1 of this year over the internet. So the opportunity lost in confidence around breaches is just so expensive. So that's something to keep in mind. The second thing is that if you're a true security vendor, your job's never done. It's not just RBAC and encryption on data at rest and data in motion. You're actively going forward. It's a living organism. You're continually treating threats. You're continually guarding the customer against internal and external threats to their technology and their sensitive data. So it's an ongoing task. It can't be a bolt-on. It can't be a check mark. It's got to be integrated native to Hadoop. And the open source projects that are addressing this, they're just going too slow. And that's the nature of the beast. I mean, it's just a different process. So, being able to wrap things around the open source today with the technology that we do have, essentially is how you move the market forward. And this is the issue. The issue is if you look at how we're monetizing this market today, there's a huge chunk of it which is pro services. And that's indicative of an early market. There's a lot more hands-on, a lot more need for help when the technology is new and infant. But as things start, that's not going to be a long-term solution because it's not going to be affordable, it's not going to be repeatable, it's not going to be scalable. And if you want to take this thing down into the mid-tier market, essentially it's got to be turnkey. It can't be something that requires a lot of resources for those sizes of organizations. And they really want to do it in the cloud. So you really need to knock off high availability, performance, and security to essentially have a real cloud implementation of this, which is really going to explode the market. I'm going to talk about that on my next slide. But this is the issue. And this is going to change. As the open source matures, the monetization of those pro services is going to shrink. And essentially there's going to be more value in the software that's enabling the solution. And that's where the market's going. And once we start seeing the pie chart take that form, you're going to see increased adoption rate of the technology. So the cloud is the perfect use case for big data and vice versa. If you think about the cloud, it's about flexible deployment of resources on a needed basis. It's cost effective, it's scalable. You can bring APIs in that allow you to blend different data sources. You can essentially blend different analytics. It's a very flexible infrastructure. But all the things I'm talking about on the premise in terms of security and performance and high availability are doubly accentuated in the cloud. When you're talking about multi-tenancy and separation of tenants and being able to maintain privacy between data, these are the issues that you have to address. So everything that we're solving on-prem is equally, if not doubly, applicable in the cloud. But the cloud's going to be a great vehicle to blow this market open in terms of access to this store, to this technology. So if you look at it from the analytics side, I mentioned earlier, analytics is pulling the market. These are the same set of issues. So a separate survey here done by the Enterprise Strategy Group came up with the same buttons, if you will, as far as what's lacking for broad adoption on the analytics side. And think about the analytics guys for a second. Essentially, these guys are they're so used to a relational database environment, which is mature, which is stable, which is highly available, which is secure. And essentially, they're looking at Hadoop and saying, wow, we believe we get it. That's going to be the store of the future. But essentially, I have hard requirements. I'm the most visible point of the solution. And if there's any kind of breach or any kind of issue, it's going to be seen through my analytics window, right? So they're very concerned about the same things that we're concerned about. And essentially, we need to knock these barriers down for these guys as well. They want to analyze more data. That's what their business is all about. And this offers a whole new source of data for them to analyze. So same concerns that we're seeing on the analytics side. And I think Peter here sums it up pretty quickly. I mean, it is the analytics that is the value point that's driving the market. What I like to kid about is we try not to get too wrapped up in ourselves. But essentially, as an infrastructure guy, I'm probably the least glamorous but the most needed part of the puzzle. Because if you can't build the store, you can't build it in a repeatable fashion, which is highly available and essentially secure, forget about the analytics, right? So that's basically where we're focused, and I think these guys also are looking for a tap, if you will, into this infrastructure that doesn't compromise their current positioning. And if you look at their positioning, they're about security, response time, high availability, and being able to do it in a transparent manner. That's another big theme that we follow as a company is how do I do this without interrupting or affecting the open source itself? How do I augment transparently? That's what these guys are about. And the second thing they're about is a speed of thought concept. And I think that's where everybody's headed. It's really the timeliness of data, being able to say, I have an issue, I have a question, I ask my question, I get an answer, right? So that's basically where these guys are focused. So let's talk about some use cases real quick. Essentially there's a couple of overarching themes that drive all of these scenarios. The first one is that there's this whole slew of useful data out there, a lot of it unstructured. And essentially, with that usefulness, though, it's directly proportional to the sensitivity in the data, in terms of confidential data, in terms of financial data. So where the real information is, it's absolutely in data that's very sensitive in terms of if it falls into the wrong hands, someone can do something very bad with that data. Secondly, all of these different verticals have compliance. So whether it's healthcare with HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or it's high tech out of the Economic and Clinical Health Act. On the healthcare side, on the finance side, it's about the Bank Security Act, BSA, AML, Anti-Money Laundering Act, those type of things. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. And if you look at retail, it's PCI, it's the payment card industry, and essentially DSS, right, as well. So all these compliances are really driving security. And that was actually mentioned in the same article from CBS News, is that what's driving security is compliance. And if you look at financial services, they have a couple of problems here which bring them to Hadoop. One is that to get at the fraudulent data that they're looking for, they're really looking at transaction records, and there's tons of them. So the first appealing thing about Hadoop is that it's a very cost-effective, scalable infrastructure that can deal with mixed data types, whether they're structured, semi-structured, unstructured. You can have one single repository which is cost-effective. The issue is, once you've gone there, is it highly available? And I don't mean name node failover. I mean, actually, are you actively monitoring all the services running on the cluster? We're going to talk a little bit about that in the conclusion. But essentially, that's what they're looking for, and they have hard compliance that they can't compromise on. So you have to be able to keep track of who's doing what to what, be able to build an audit log, be able to essentially encrypt and decrypt data, whether it's in transit or at rest, manage the private keys, make sure they don't fall in the right hands. All these things that these guys are worried about is around compliance. Healthcare, same thing. Essentially, this is the first time in my career, and I've been selling to the enterprise a long time, first time in my career that the healthcare guys are the first ones to the trough. They're usually, late adopters, more conservative, wait for the maturity of the technology. What's bringing them to us sooner is the fact that they have reams of this unstructured data. And in that unstructured data, they can do not just fraud detection, but they can do patient profiling. They can actually have collective diagnosis, if you will, by combining records, by combining doctors' notes. There's so much useful information out there that they can do a lot of things to move their industry forward and move healthcare forward. But essentially, they're under HIPAA and high-tech compliance. And so in accessing that data, they have certain rules in how they do it and how they secure the sensitive information. On the retail side, the transaction stuff is actually laced with personal information as well. That's the issue. And so for these guys, it's 24/7 processing, so reliability is a key thing. High availability is a key thing for them. But let's look at the eBay breach. They actually protected the financial information, but the personal information got lost, right? So you have to worry about, not just the credit cards, but Jim Vought's address, his email address, his home address, any other personal information you hold on Jim Vought is also exposed. And they're under compliance as well, under PCI DSS, as well as some of the financial ones as well. So if I could just wrap up a few points here. We've covered a lot in a very short time here. But essentially, the real focus is on the applications. That's where people are going to get the answers in terms of the questions that they have. And this is a competitive advantage. And they're seeing people that are accessing new sources of data that they want to access. And essentially, in accessing and making sense of those sources of data, they can make better decisions. So this is, evolve or die. Essentially, it's keep up with the Joneses. So they're the ones pulling us, but they have requirements and they have set expectation with their customers in terms of what they've done in relational database environments, as we mentioned before. Comprehensive security, being able to integrate security natively with the infrastructure. This is key. This is all the things that I mentioned within the presentation. Not bolting something on, not bolting encryption on, but essentially being able to infuse it in the fabric so that it's dynamic. The data sits anywhere within this parallel environment, and it can be duped, it can be on any node within the cluster. How do you dynamically treat that information in a timely manner without impacting performance and without creating other security holes within the infrastructure? This is a big job. This isn't check the box. In terms of the integration, again, making it very transparent. We actually support a JDBC, ODBC connector, and it's our BI connector, as we call it. And that's not the important part. It's opening up the framework that we've created native to Hadoop that allows the applications to tap that transparently. So that now when you log into an application, that policy is automatically and transparently translated to the cluster itself. That's true integrated end-to-end security and a system approach in terms of being able to do that transparently. Also, if you look at high reliability, it's not just about name node failover. That's not the only issue. The issue when you talk to an enterprise is anything I have running on that cluster needs to be monitored and failed over if it fails. You take Kerberos, for example. If Kerberos fails, it stops issuing tickets. You can't process jobs. It takes the cluster down. Name node failover is not going to cover that. That's a service fail on a particular node. So taking that kind of system view, important things like key management. If that goes down, you're no longer able to encrypt, decrypt data. You got to be able to monitor all those processes. So it's bigger in solution than just the open source ecosystem components. That's the point. And so the last piece here is more automation. So being able to chunk nodes, that's what we want people to do. We want them to add nodes. It's not very interesting sitting on a 10 or 20 node evaluation cluster. This stuff was engineered for 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 node clusters. And so being able to automate that process, being able to set policy and security once, native to the infrastructure, that it's automatically applied as new nodes join the cluster. All that stuff is very important, and I think that's what people are really concerned about is that I've started with ProServe, I get it, it's early, but before I deploy, I don't want to go hire 8 guys to manage the infrastructure, and I don't want to continue to pay pro services. So that's the shift in the monetization that we talked about. And in a nutshell, that's how we view anyway, and I think in asking about this presentation, that's how we view creating an enterprise-ready solution around Hadoop. That's all I have. Thank you. I can pop that. Are there any questions? We do have a little bit of time. I can take a few questions. Are there any questions? Yeah. There's a mic right here. Unless you talk loud, that's okay.
So I was hoping that you can provide a little bit of detail on, because the note there is you're the leader of big data security.
Yes.
So security-wise, what are you doing differently than any other solution there? Because Apple released CloudKit and there's EC2, there's App Engine, and why are you better?
Very good question, thank you. It's not supposed to be a company information commercial, but I will take it anyway. But essentially, there's a couple options out there today, right? We've been at this for a couple of years, and it's a sizable task in making sure that you've actually secured components within the ecosystem, and you've done it in a transparent way. Key management is not trivial. We're a little bit different company. We actually file patents around our IP, because it's not a trivial exercise to actually deal with the keys in a distributed manner as this architecture suggests. The bolt-ons are, as I affectionately call them, like Gazang, is really a separate encryption solution. I mean, Gazang doesn't even support Kerberos, right? So there's going to be considerable work just to infuse that technology within the framework, which we've been working on for 2 years. That's one thing. The open source projects are it's slow. That's all it is. I mean, it's a contributory type community. It takes time for that to actually materialize in the open source. The reason we think we're better, I would say, is because we have actually a native solution that gets deployed with the clusters as you're configuring the clusters in a repeatable fashion. It's highly automated in terms of how you set up the key management configuration. It's highly automated in terms of how you pull in an existing HSM server that houses the keys with KMIP. We don't recreate access lists within the ecosystem like Sentry does. Essentially, we tap Active Directory and LDAP because those roles and policies already exist, and we apply those transparently to the cluster. And then we open up a BI interface so that we can now tie applications to that infrastructure. So I'm sure we could have feature poker. You're never going to win that game because everybody can check the little boxes, but that's a holistic end-to-end solution that's actually native to the Hadoop environment. And oh, by the way, runs on multiple distributions. It runs on HTTP, it runs on CDH, it runs on Pivotal, it runs on raw Apache. And it runs on 1.x and 2.x because there are issues with 2.x right now. So that's how we're a little different. We're trying to make sure that we give as many choices to the customer. That make sense?
One of the things is that, is there anything that you guys are doing that protects you from not getting into a position that if, let's say, government is trying to get your data, and how do you protect the users?
If the government wants your data, they will take your data. That is a governance issue. That is not a technology issue. So I can't stop that, but I'm not a guerrilla warfare military group, but basically, if they want your data, they'll take it. And they'll ask us to give them the key so they can decrypt it. That's right. Question, there was one over here. No? Any questions over here? You guys will let me off easy. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.